Um, okay. So today we have a pivotal figure in internet music history. Founder of influential net label Zoomlens, now has started a new label, Metaphysica, has collaborated with Maltine Records, has collaborated with Adult Swim, has, very much been around the block, as it were, in terms of, the truly international internet music community. Meishi Smile, thank you so much for joining me today. How's it
Yeah.
going?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very polite intro. I think it's the nicest intro I've ever had from somebody, actually.
Hey, that's
Yeah.
what you deserve.
Uh,
So yeah, I want to talk about a few different things today. I think probably a easy way or easy place to kick off is to sort of give you the floor to detail the transition from your previous label Zoom Lens into your current label Metaphysica, and sort of just talk about your main inspirations for that transition and that move. And if you kind of just want to also talk a little bit about um the history of Zoom Lens a little bit to give context to those that might not yet know.
yeah. So Zoom Lens was a label I started in about maybe the end of high school, maybe around 2009, 2010, when it started to be something that felt more of a sort of solid foundation of what I want to express. Back then, I was very much part of the Santa Ana noise scene. There's a really great noise and punk scene of a lot of marginalized groups that are doing very alternative sort of art. And we used to do shows at the art center there, the Orange County Center of Arts. They would host like a sort of yearly noise festival, and so I became very integrated into that scene. And it was the first time where I very much experienced a sort of alternative scene, music collective culture that I was actually a part of and felt a part of. And there's a certain point where I wanted to basically expand outside of that and sort of utilize a lot of things I learned, a lot of the sort of collective attributes that they had to that, where they're basically making their own physical products. It was the onset of digital music and the sort of digital revolution of internet culture, and wanting to take that and apply it into a way that wasn't just simply bound to the foundations of harsh noise and sort of like punk rock sentiments, but be able to transpose that onto electronic music and sort of more emotive iterations of pop music. So basically, it started with my own projects. Long story short, it expanded outside of that. I met people through MySpace and Facebook, at Last FM, and other sort of social networks that were popular amongst that time, and eventually just became something bigger than myself and something that was beyond myself. And I think I had a sort of insular take of what that was at the beginning, but eventually, when people catch on to something or believe in something in a certain way, they're bound to project a certain role or sort of identity onto the label. And so Zoom Lens very much eventually became this sort of international thing where, going more into the history, collaborating with Maltine Records, this great prolific Japanese net label who basically paved a lot of the way for what people may perceive as hyperpop or other sort of, digital genres in general. And we had a great footing with them and basically expanded into, places like Japan, Singapore, China, Philippines, other places like that, and became, sort of more of a bridge of, east to west, so to speak, to condense it down to generalize that. And became also this thing very much rooted in, I'd say, marginalized identities, focusing a lot of, especially back then when sort of Asian American, Asian representation in music was a little less so. And to basically just sort of jump into where things are now, eventually Zoom Lens ended for various reasons. And Metaphysica, my new label that I've co-founded with my friend Adi, who goes under the artist name the Cute Hospital, we started that only about 6 months ago. I would say the main differences between Zoom Lens and Metaphysica is that Zoom Lens, as I've sort of alluded to, it's this sort of more insular, sort of based around identity, based around singular identity. It was very much started amongst punk rock roots, harsh noise, etc. There's a sort of anger in it that felt more insular, more expressive, where Metaphysica is much more about a communal sense of that and the expansiveness beyond just basically towards the end, the zoom lens artists were already transitioning from writing about themselves towards writing about larger, broader topics. For instance, my last record, Resentment, which is about my own gender, expression and identity, and a lot of political topics. And Mark Redito releases Natural Habitat, which was essentially about a lot of aspects of wellness and nature. So it was this transition towards wanting to speak about something beyond ourselves. And Metaphysica, I feel, encapsulates that in many ways. And it is still very much rooted in anger and very much rooted in something against a sort of set systems of, generally speaking, not just music, and sort of a transcendental rage, so to speak, taking these cues from religion and spirituality and combining that with the sort of deconstructive, I would say, deconstructing pop culture and pop culture tropes and musical tropes that Zoomlens did. It's basically a larger presentation of that.
I think it's interesting how you mentioned that Maltine, being this very influential, important net label in terms of the way that internet music kind of evolved over the past decade, and a lot of the digital genres that stem from internet music. Because, well, I wholeheartedly agree with that. It's interesting because, when I was making that docuseries on the origins of hyperpop, and trying to make that, or trying to create that thread between like the early SoundCloud internet music days into like what we now think of as hyperpop or the contemporary hyperpop movement. Basically every single person that I interviewed mentioned you or Zoom Lens as a, incredibly influential aspect to their own connection to the internet and to internet music, both musically and also just like in terms of just being a part of that community. And how listening to music that came from the internet inspired them to make their own music and want to be a part of that scene. So Zoom Lens, for me, from my own perspective, like up there with the other very influential net labels of that time. So you touched on it a little bit, but I would love to hear, and feel free to like go full ego and like pat yourself on the back. You deserve it. I truly think so. So, I'm really curious from your own perspective where you think Zoom Lens fits in the overall legacy of internet music, whether it's aesthetically, philosophically, like whatever. I would be really curious.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear, like amusing even to hear that people have cited me as that and feel that way, because I feel in the process of doing it that there was never that feeling that I had that sort of inspiration, so to speak. So it's a very humbling thing to hear now. And especially being around at this point, I feel is maybe more so the circumstance of being able to look at things in a larger hindsight of the context of this music changing, the cultural climate, the political climate, this whole decade, now being able to perceive things that I may have been a part of, whether that was conscious or unconsciously or subconsciously, or so to speak. So I think it is very interesting to have a place in that. I think it's something that I'm still processing because I feel like I'm always looking towards the next thing at this point. And yeah, perhaps I will admit, there's times where people have came to me now enough that have said, oh, this is a catalyst for this or that, or a bigger artist says, oh, well, I was looking to this and I was inspired by you to do this. And it's sort of this strange place also as a more so what people would consider an independent artist or a smaller artist, so to speak, on a that relative scale, that to see these sort of people a part of that culture become very, say, popular, big now, and sort of zoom lens and Metaphysica and myself having been at this place for having been at this for a very long time, I suppose it's something that I can never stay in the same place for too long,
Yeah.
mentally, creatively. So I think it would be interesting to see that sort of acknowledgement from the people who are at top, so to speak, at times,
Yeah.
to be able to, be a part of this, like, hey, play our show or be part of this.
Yeah.
But I think there's an aspect of, and I think it's a historical thing that happens a lot too. You see the sort of context of like smaller artists paving the way for larger artists. You see it in like punk rock, like groups like Death, paving the way for groups which is sort of take away that, maybe even evolve that context in a certain way, or maybe commodify that context more, like Sex Pistols and other groups that came out of that. So I see parts of it now in what I'm doing, and it's a mixture of emotions, I would say. But ultimately, I think there's nothing that I can really do aside from just continuously doing what I'm doing. So I think that's sort of the thing that I've come to terms with, or not in such a like a sad, depressive way, but more so that for myself and my music in general and anything that I've been a part of, it's always about resilience. And it's always a part of resilience as, you know, maybe people of a certain identity in this world, people of a certain cultural, ethnic, or economic background, that being part of a resilience that is always wanting to change the curve of culture and wanting to change the curve of combined effort and community, and to ultimately be a part of the rubber band that sort of facilitates this sort of growth of things snowballing is in itself something to be very happy and proud of. So to answer your question, that's sort of how I feel when it comes to that notion.
Right. And it's interesting how from the people I've talked to who were very foundational to, I guess, that initial snowball, it's interesting to hear this range of perspectives about their own feelings towards sort of where everything is now. And I think kind of what you're saying is a good segue into the next section, or next question rather, because the internet music ecosystem has certainly shifted. Now you have this new generation of kids who are who are online, still making kind of like these wacky sounds, but some of whom are getting, very serious music industry attention, signing major label deals, like the whole 9 yards. And in that process, I feel like the democratization of music that the internet had kind of initially promised has been kind of turned into just another pipeline into the mainstream music industry for kind of, many of the same kind of normalized faces that we've seen over the history of the music industry. And you kind of touched on it, but I don't know if that's been frustrating, if that's been a frustrating transition to witness, especially given kind of like your, strong philosophical ideas about like what internet music can be and what music can be in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel throughout any sort of place in history, this is something that reoccurs for various reasons, and might not be able to touch on all of them. But perhaps within the context of this interview, it's important to touch on hyperpop and adjacent sort of genres. And I would say, it's always amazing in general, and I'm very inspired by, the artists on Metaphysica are making very adjacent music to that genre and are very young and have this sort of energy where they can tap into anything and pull from everything. And that is essentially the same way that I was feeling when I was growing up. So I would never feel like I could necessarily have any sort of resentment or anger towards the younger generation just doing what they want to do. But I think it's more so this idea of the music economy and marketing and this sort of recontextualization, sort of changing the history of music culture to better suit certain artists who are very much espoused by larger corporations or larger labels, I feel that's sort of where it gets very iffy in a way. And I wouldn't make the assertion that, nothing personal to groups such as like 100 gecs or whatnot, but they are very much espoused as the creators of hyperpop, the creators of this genre. I really doubt they said that themselves, but the fact that entities such as Pitchfork, they're signed to a major label who is very good at marketing them as these sort of faces of hyperpop, it is very much diminishing towards the people who came before them. I can think a decade or even slightly more than that. You had artists such as Leaf or Mickey Blanco. This is a historical aspect of it too. Very much, Black artists, also artists from Asia, making genres such as hardcore or dempa, playing along with genres of trance music, chiptune, and even the chiptune scene in America or chiptune scene in the UK or Germany, the demo scene in general. Hyperpop is sort of the culmination of taking a lot of cues from that, and at the same time, it's a lot of it does evolve the genre. A lot of it isn't just a simple replication. So I would say acts who do that, it's very much, I'm not sure if I would say a necessity, but it is an evolution of music that can't be denied or should necessarily be, cast aside. But I think the acknowledgement of those sort of artists and genres that really set the path for it and are relatively unknown or obscure still, it is important to note those people and also to leverage them as well. And for these artists who are inspired by these people, to also bring them up as well. But it is a part of the sort of, I would say, the music marketing aspect, where it's sort of individualism, where it's like, oh, I conceived this from myself and this was just from me, and my inspiration didn't come from so and so, or if it did, it's very sort of hidden in a way. And I think that's the only part where it gets very problematic territory of the sort of more what a lot of net music and even on TikTok now and other music communities, the more the sharing and the uplifting of music rather than the gatekeeping of it.
Right. And just hearing you describe kind of like what you hope Metaphysica to be, it really feels like Metaphysica, both from a releasing music standpoint and also the community events that you have hosted or plan on hosting, seems like that can be a way to kind of like recenter the focus onto that upliftment of music as like the primary focus. And I don't know, for you, do you feel like Metaphysica is like a way for you to kind of reattach yourself to those concepts? Like, what is your relationship to internet music now, and is Metaphysica a way to kind of like reorient yourself into that mindset?
Yeah, it's a way to reorder myself into the foundation of the mindset of being so entranced and being so drawn to internet music, because internet music, the context has changed. And there's this great article in the Japan Times with Tomad, who was a founder of Maltina Records, where he says basically that internet music, it means anything now. It means you just post your music online. So it doesn't have the same connotations that it did before, when internet music was this sort of feeling of essentially a push against the standard practices of the music industry and creating something that was very punk rock in a sense, that was eventually very co-opted and commodified and turned into whatever iteration it is at now. So it's about going back to the feeling of that, and the feeling of that was essentially wanting to bring people together who felt this sort of authenticity, were able to put their ego aside to enjoy music together. And it's funny because it's, even though we're farther along the cultural sphere, the technological sphere, I'm no longer invested in this aspect of internet music or a net label as much as I was before. Now it's wanting to do more physical events again. And even towards the end of Zoom Lens, it was that, because everyone sort of had at their time this space of time where the internet felt much more of a safe space. The internet felt much more of a place less privatized and less commodified. And the way to actually be able to have that deep level of connection again is to be able to have that physical space again, to be able to create that have that sort of energy. And of course that there is aspects to that, of course, with everything going on in the world right now and COVID, that it is not, you know, still liking to have that aspect where for those able to do that, you know, we could have that physical space, but we also have our digital space as well. So having the balance of that still is always going to be important. But I think the one thing that is very maybe even frightening is this aspect of, you know, the metaverse and things like that. And Metaphysica is, it's funny because we came up with that name maybe like a few weeks before the metaverse was announced, and it does really, it feels timely now. It feels that we're sort of part of this understanding the trajectory of where the future of this hyper commodified, formerly private space of the internet is becoming, and wanting to remind people that whether you're online or whether you're in a physical space, that there is this sense of where things can remain tangible and things can have value and things aren't just simply being made for, I would say, like hiding from reality. Like you could still face the reality of things while being online, face the reality of things in person, and to be able to be resilient and see a brighter future for all of us. And I feel that's where a lot of my anger comes from, the ability to want to enact change. And I feel aspects of like the metaverse is very much hiding away from that and creating the space, such as like billionaires wanting to, you know, move off to Mars, or people creating an online space where you can just sort of ignore everything that's happening, the consequences of the political sphere and climate change and everything else that affects everyone as a whole.
And I kind of want to talk about the new music now and kind of the transition from Resentiment into the new album. I don't know what you call it mixtape or EP. Or what do you call the Melancholia I?
Yeah, I consider it more so of a mixtape for many reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah. So yeah, Resentiment, fantastic record, one of my favorites of last year. You know, that project shared a lot of aesthetic similarities, if you like, to your past work. You know, I feel like you've always been interested in the kind of shoegazy-esque atmospheres, you know, with fuzz and sort of lots of vocal processing. But there was a certainly more kind of rock, almost industrial angle to that album. You know, I do want to talk about your influences in a second, but it did kind of remind me almost of like a theatrical goth, like Deer and Gray type vibe. I don't know if that was a direct influence, and I'm sure there's tons of others that went into that album that are, you know, probably more esoteric than that. But yeah, and this new album, Melancholia I, or new mixtape, which is also fantastic. First Metaphysica release, I believe, or first project that was released.
Yeah, the first one I've released, and we've released one other so far by Viatix is
Right.
artist from Singapore. Yeah.
Right. And you know, it almost feels like a return to like the lush, scenic, electronic J-pop elements of Lust.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of talked about this already a little bit, but if you kind of want maybe expand on it a little bit more, I guess what inspired that initial pivot into the kind of tone that you explored on Resentiment, and then is this new project a sort of like a clean slate and an intentional return to the early work that you were initially pushing on Zoom Lens?
Yeah. First off, I think it's really interesting you mentioned Deer and Gray, because I don't know if we've ever talked about them. That's like my favorite band, like my top
Really?
five
Okay.
favorite groups.
Okay,
So, yeah,
I
think
did
it's
not.
very important.
I didn't know that, but I'm glad that I
So,
was able to pick up on.
yeah, that's really cool. You know them. Yeah, it's they very much informed a lot of what I do. Um, and yeah, it is. I feel the way I presented Melancholia. Well, I I pronounce it both ways. Melancholia One, which is the allusion to the original Durer piece, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Mm.
And also I pronounce it as Melancholia I as an I of the self. I could go more into that later, but it was very intentional to that I knew people would perceive it as a return to form, a return to a certain genre. And that's part of why I label it as a mixtape as well, because I'm very weary of this concept of nostalgia and sort of shoulder, like, hey, I'm doing something that I did in the past and you should all sort of join me in being nostalgic about it and having these feelings of the past. But Meishi and everything I do is always wanting to move forward, and if there's any sort of reference that seems like it's about the past, it's more so about the deconstruction of the past and deconstruction of memory
Mm.
and nostalgia versus melancholy. And I feel those concepts are sometimes intertwined with each other, and that people feel melancholy and nostalgia are the same thing. But to me, nostalgia is more of a term that in current motion is a fixation on the past and a fixation on what could have been in older ways, where melancholy is more so the resounding emotion of what the past was, but turning that into something new, turning that into something that is relevant to the time period. So I've always enjoyed those sounds still. If I'm to talk about the music of it, it felt like it was a proper place of time, not because of, those songs being unreleased, but just that Resentiment served its place. It was very much an album of its time. And now I feel music needs to be in this place where you can still hold on to rage and you can still hold on to anger, but it could be done silently in a way. And I look to groups like the Radio Department or Foxes in Fiction, Pet Shop Boys, even groups like that, who have always had a sort of very romantic and political slant to the music, but it's very understated. And that sort of understated anger of continuously moving forward. I've been listening to a lot of like Tracy Chapman as
Mm.
well lately, and that resonates with me too. All the songs are very full of, I would say, disillusionment and wanting to move forward and anger, but it's done in such a very pretty way that it feels the place of Meishi, at this moment, is to do things in that very sort of almost like, magical realism, this very pretty, quaint way, but to acknowledge still what is happening in the world, having a more of a balance, so sort of like a yin and a yang. And so, the music and resentment, I may return to that. In fact, I still feel like I play shows like that are noise music and whatnot, but just being able to balance those two, going back to whatever I feel like is appropriate for myself and for the moment. Even now, I'm understanding a lot of why I made like my first album, so to speak. And you're talking about, sort of production, like vocals or things like that. And I was making a very conscious effort. Well, maybe not conscious, but maybe almost the line of conscious and subconscious. My vocals were always very manipulated and vocoded at the start because I wanted the music to sound very genderless.
Mm.
And at the start of Meishi, I didn't reveal any sort of personal information about myself. And I was very influenced by Japanese groups like Shinsei Kamate-chan, who manipulate their voice, and people at the start were thinking, oh, this sounds like a child, it's, tapping into his inner child. And people eventually found out that they considered themselves non-binary. So it's actually them taking the role as like, oh, another gender. And that's what I wanted to do with my music at the start. Is very intentional, that my vocals will be warped beyond that perception. That it's more of a projection of how you may perceive who is behind it.
About you think very deeply about all of these things, but I also just feel like in general, like your music knowledge, just your direct music knowledge runs really super deep. So I would be curious sort of like who are some of your biggest musical influences, and then who are some maybe like less known artist movements that have inspired you that you think people should check out.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot lately. I've been just trying to rationalize like where I draw from and what dictates me. And just to get the straight answer first, top five musical influences. Definitely, actually, D and Gray, as mentioned, my first influence. Just how they played around with their sort of perception of gender identity, the perception of they can constantly be this malleable sort of force and change their presentation over and over again while making very soft music, very hard extreme music.
Right.
Then I would say definitely the radio department, the lyricism, the contrast of romantic themes with political themes, anti-fascist themes, while making very dreamy, subdued music. Fei Wang definitely as well, just the ethereal quality to her. The Replacements had a huge
Mm,
inspiration on me growing up. They're sort of my people grew up with the Beatles or whatever. The Replacements were sort of my
mm,
Beatles and informed this sort of heart on your sleeve, sort of underdog sentiment of music. I'll also say anything produced by Yasaka Nakata, Perfume, Capsule, Kyari Pami Pamu. Also anything made by Ai Yamatsuka, the leader of Boredoms and various other harsh noise projects. And of course, Corn's always up there as well. They really taught me that, Linkin Park, how to hone your anger, how to recover from, the traumas of your life. And outside of that, I find myself more influenced by like film, really, and a lot of philosophy and political texts, maybe even more so than music these days, because I feel I've come to the place where I'm sort of understanding how to write music more, where I want it to be more this vehicle for my ideology, and I can be very too inspired sometimes by music, actually, that it might cut into where I should really come from on a personal level. It might be too influenced to be something else rather than to be more tuned into what I really want to convey. So a lot of times I actually listen to music, my music influence, music inspirations after I've sort of laid the template for my music already, because I want there to be that sentiment where it feels a bit more honest to myself and less of a reaction to like what's popular, or like, oh, I wish I made this thing, and
right.
yeah.
Is there ever like a moment that brings out a specific, I guess, mode of musical expression?
Yeah, I'd say more consciously in the past, again, 2 to 3 years since Sensory Sentiment, where it's become this thing where I have more control, more acknowledgement of my emotions and how I put that into my art versus my everyday life. And I think it's right now it's very much speaking about, again, to go back to like Melancholia I, Melancholia I, is that to fight the aspect of escapism again, and to be able to unveil this shroud of this sort of what has become of this idea of identity, what has become this idea of community,
Mm,
of shared values and shared knowledge, but still feeling very isolated and insular, and how to. And it's funny because it does come back to like where I started at the noise scene, finding something so different, something so radical that existed within its own sphere, and basically wanted to recreate that just with different genres and different tones and different people, and where I am now as a person much older than where I began, but ultimately with myself having those core values,
Mm,
still having that essence of
right.
wanting to be something that is always feels more part of the counter culture,
That's
so to speak.
amazing. I think that's a kind of a great way to it's a great summary, I think, of the many things that we've talked about. But yeah, I kind of just want to then give this space to you, these final moments to just sort of express anything that you want to, or what's next for Meishi Smile, what's next for Metaphysica, or just yeah, the floor is yours to just say whatever the fuck you want.
Yeah. Well, what comes next will be a surprise for everyone. And I want it to be a surprise for myself. So I'll keep the details limited, but that I do very much feel, I think there's a point of time, and I'm not sure if other people felt it, where I did want to end Meishi Smile, and Zoomlands did end, but of course now it's this iteration of Metaphysica that I do with other people, not just myself now. But Meishi is something that I more and more feel very much like this is my life work, and I am in the place now where I do want to revisit other projects, and like Yuko Mata and other projects I had when I was doing more ambient and noise music, and that this is something that I have become more reaffirmed that you know for anyone looking out for this to not be worried that it will come to an end, because I very much feel part of this process and wanting to continue doing it. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
thank you for the space, and
of course.
thank you for allowing me to express all this and taking up your time and everything.
Of course. And I'm sure many will be positively reassured that Meishi Smile is not going anywhere, at least anytime soon. And yeah, thank you so much for your intelligence, your music, of course. And just like, yeah, I feel honored to even just share this space with you right now, to chop it up in this way with you. It's an honor.